little about material possessions. The clergy thought Molière implied that Tartuffe was a representative of their vocation. They thought Molière believed that the Christian religion was nothing but a show to swindle believers out of their money. But in his preface to the comedy, Molière declared, "I have used all the art and skill that I could to distinguish clearly the character of the hypocrite from that of the truly devout man." Molière's Tartuffe fit an age during which Europe produced more absolute rulers than at any other time in history. Tartuffe, for instance, is not the only character struggling to gain control. In fact, Orgon's mother, Madame Pernelle, fools herself into believing that her son is obedient to her in everything. And of course, Orgon considers himself the absolute ruler in his home. In fact, Orgon is blinded by his own desire to take control over others' lives. Tartuffe even takes advantage of this. By pretending to serve Orgon, Tartuffe is able to hide his motives from him. The other characters recognize Tartuffe's hypocrisy. Although Tartuffe acts as if he is in love with Orgon's daughter, Marianne, all the while he is lusting after Orgon's wife, Elmire. When Tartuffe makes a pass at her, Orgon's son, Damy, witnesses it. But Orgon cannot believe that Tartuffe would do anything so vulgar, and when Damy won't apologize for embarrassing Tartuffe, Orgon disowns Damy and kicks him out of the house. Well, Molière created an interesting and amusing plot problem by making Elmire play the hypocrite in order to expose Tartuffe's hypocrisy. While Orgon hides beneath a table, Elmire pretends to be attracted to Tartuffe. Tartuffe does not believe Elmire because, as a hypocrite himself, he does not trust others. Therefore, he demands proof of her affection. Elmire explains that she rejected his attentions before because a woman in polite society is expected to refrain from the frank acknowledgement of sexual desire. But if Tartuffe were more perceptive, Elmire says, then he would recognize that,
however high the passion which inflames us, still to confess its power somehow shames us. Thus we reluct at first, yet in a tone which tells you that our heart is overthrown, that what our lips deny our pulse confesses, and that in time all no's will turn to yeses.
The audience knows that Elmire is lying about lying. Her first rejection of Tartuffe's sexual aggression was sincere. Well, what do you think? If Elmire practiced deception to protect herself and others, does that make her a hypocrite? This amusing scene also raises the question, why wouldn't a woman feel free to say so if she were sexually attracted to a man? Well, of course, Elmire is married. But what if she were single? And her statement is made to persuade Tartuffe that although she is married, she is also willing to be his mistress. But before Tartuffe gets his proof, Orgon confronts him. However, it is already too late. Orgon has signed away his property to Tartuffe. Fortunately, a great king knows about Tartuffe and sends guards to arrest him. Molière praised Louis XIV with his description of the king who intervened to save Orgon and his family. "We serve a prince to whom all sham is hateful, a prince who sees into our inmost hearts and can't be fooled by any trickster's arts." This flattery was inspired by Molière's gratitude for Louis's patronage and approval of Tartuffe. Perhaps he went to an extreme to win Louis's favor. In his second petition, he hailed Louis as the source of power and authority, the just dispenser of absolute law, the sovereign judge and master of all. In fact, Louis was the source of power in France. Therefore, Molière brazenly congratulated himself when he claimed to be the playwright who made the monarch laugh who makes all Europe tremble. Another very humorous play by Molière, The Misanthrope, may have been inspired by his unhappy marriage. In the play, Alceste deludes himself into believing that he loves Célimène, and that she loves him and she is willing to retire with him to a reclusive lifestyle. However, Célimène represents everything he despises about society. Alceste explains that reason doesn't rule in love, you know. But when Célimène is forced to choose between a peaceful life of solitude with Alceste or the glamour of high society, she chooses society life. Alceste is demoralized because he thought his honesty and integrity would win her love. But even his best friend, Philinte, believes Alceste has taken his rejection of polite society to an extreme. For Alceste, the only solution is to break with the whole human race. "My God," Alceste complains, "it chills my heart to see the ways men come to terms with evil nowadays. Sometimes I swear I'm moved to flee and find some desert land unfouled by humankind." but Philent is more philosophical about the matter. Philent concludes that these faults of which you so complain are part of human nature, I maintain, and it's no more a matter for disgust that men are knavish, selfish, and unjust than that the vulture dines upon the dead and wolves are furious and apes ill-bred. Some critics suggest this play reveals a psychological tension which Molière experienced in himself as he both tried to flatter his patron and wished he could speak his mind freely. There certainly were pressures on Molière and others at Versailles to speak with tact, and sometimes to flatter their king or their political opponents. The Misanthrope was written at about the same time as Molière was writing letters to Louis requesting that the king lift the ban on Tartuffe. In that context, the dialogue between Alceste and his best friend Philent has more significance than a simple disagreement between friends. The play shows both Molière's desire to be considered first among entertainers to the king and his disgust with the social practices demanded by life at the court. Among those who wrote about uncontrollable passions which disturbed the social order, Racine was foremost. Racine was also a playwright in the court of Louis XIV. Like Molière, he addressed his plays to aristocratic concerns and made his writing conform to the king's taste for classical literature. His success at this won his election to the French Academy in 1673. His education in classical literature had prepared him for his position at the court. Moreover, his upbringing had taught him to view humanity as fallen. In combination with his belief in original sin, he held a fatalistic view that he had learned from Greek literature. These ideas would be expressed separately and together in his later works. It was a poem on the marriage of Louis XIV that first brought him to the attention of the king. After he became a personal friend of Molière, his future at Versailles was assured. However, the enemies of his play Phèdre created such an intrigue that, in 1677, Racine retired from theater and accepted the position of Louis's official historiographer. Phèdre was a play based upon Euripides' tragedy of Hippolytus. In Euripides' play, the emphasis is on the unwarranted suffering of Hippolytus. But Racine turned the spotlight on the helplessness of Phèdre. When Racine's Phèdre recognizes the passion in her heart for Hippolytus, her stepson, she suppresses it. But when a false report that Theseus has died is received by her nurse, all circumstances conspire to cause her to act on her love for Hippolytus. Her nurse encourages her to declare her love to him. Phèdre's profession of love leads to a confession that reveals her self-loathing and indicates how deep the religious concepts of predestination and original sin penetrated Racine's soul.
Poor victim that I am of heaven's curse, I loathe myself. You could not hate me worse. The gods could tell how in this breast of mine they lit the flame that's tortured all my line. Those cruel gods for whom it is but play to lead a feeble woman's heart astray. Avenge yourself now, punish my foul desire. Come, rid the world like your heroic sire of one more monster. Do as he'd have done.
Phèdre condemns herself because her love is directed toward the son of her deceased husband. Elmire also said women are ashamed to confess the passion which inflames us. In these characters, we get a hint that their creators were fascinated by the force of love and lust, by the drive of sexual desire and the will to power. Well, Hippolytus is shocked by Phèdre's profession of her love for him, and when he repulses her, later Theseus, who was believed to be dead, returns from his journey. Then Hippolytus asks permission to leave the court. Again, Ione intervenes, convincing Theseus that it was Hippolytus that made advances to Phèdre. Theseus calls on Neptune to destroy his son. Out of respect for his father, Hippolytus will not blame Phèdre. In sorrow, Phèdre commits suicide by drinking poison. And as she dies, she confesses. But it is too late. Neptune has already destroyed Hippolytus. Theseus is left alone with his pain. In Racine's tragedies, noble characters such as Phèdre and Hippolytus are subjected to the forces of powerful emotions and are shown to be ordinary people with uncertain minds and weak wills. His education and religious upbringing had taught Racine to expect to find sin deep in the human heart. Racine's Phèdre reflects his tragic view of life. As in Phèdre, the theme of most of Racine's plays was passion, and especially the passion of a passionate love of a woman, which subverts the social order. This emphasis on order and subversive human behaviors illustrates how these authors responded to the concerns of the French court and its classical values. Baroque authors in England had similar concerns. In England, James I wrote a treatise entitled The Divine Right of Kings. In this tract, James claimed absolute authority had been granted to him by God, who had placed him on the throne. Charles I followed in James's footsteps. Consequently, social order and absolute power, and the power of passion, are themes found in English Baroque literature. The influence of the classical tradition was also evident. For example, there was the notion that epic poetry was the highest form of literature. Poets of the time aspired to write an epic to rival the creations of the ancient Greek bard Homer and the famous Roman poet Virgil. So it was that John Milton's life goal was realized with the completion of his Christian epic, Paradise Lost. In Paradise Lost, Milton revealed the Baroque concern with the power of an absolute ruler, with the passions which upset the universal order, and with the concept of original sin. As Milton indicated in his summary of Book 1, the whole subject of the first book is man's disobedience. Thus, in his attempt to explain God's plan for mankind, he begins by explaining the nature and cause of evil. Remember that Augustine was the first to give philosophic support to the doctrine of original sin. He condemned as sinful the imperfections and limitations of the body, which the Neoplatonists perceived as amoral. Taking the concept of original sin for granted, Milton called on the Holy Spirit to give him poetic inspiration and to explain why Adam and Eve had sinned in the first place. Say, what cause moved our grandparents in that happy state, favored of heaven so highly, to fall off from their Creator and transgress His will, for one restraint lords of the world besides? Who first seduced them to that foul revolt? Beginning as he does in Book 1 with this question, Milton uses foreshadowing and dramatic development throughout the following books to present the answer. Then in Book 9, Milton's narrative presents an argument for placing the blame on Adam, who ate because he could not bear to be separated from Eve. This is an illustration by the Romantic poet William Blake. In it, we see Adam who confesses that because his love for Eve was so great, he acted contrary to God's command. Eve admits that she was tempted and that her desire overcame her will, but Eve ate the fruit of the forbidden tree because Satan tempted her. Ultimately, Milton shows that it was Satan's vainglory which disrupted the universe. In fact, all the suffering that came upon the earth after Adam and Eve sinned was initiated before they were created. As indicated in Book 1, chaos ensued when Satan, with arrogance and envy, attempted to ascend to the throne of God. The infernal serpent, he it was whose guile, stirred up with envy and revenge, deceived the mother of mankind. What time his pride had cast him out from heaven, with all his host of rebel angels, by whose aid aspiring to set himself in glory above his peers, he trusted to have equaled the Most High, if he opposed and with ambitious aim against the throne and monarchy of God, raised in pious war in heaven and battle proud with vain attempt. Overall, Milton's explanation of original sin reveals the Baroque fascination with powerful passions which threaten to destroy the social order. Against these forces, Baroque authors marshaled representations of absolute authority. In Book 1, the fallen angels acknowledge God as the source of absolute power and authority when they respond in unison. I now of force believe almighty, since no less than such a force could have o'erpowered such a force as ours. And it is only through the agency of this absolute power that order will be restored. This restoration begins in Book 3, when the Son of God offers himself as a ransom to pay for the sin of mankind. Later in Book 10, the Son of God goes to the Garden of Eden to bring judgment. Then the Son of God intercedes on behalf of the repentant Adam and Eve in Book 11. From Book 11 through the end of the epic in Book 12, Adam is given a revelation of God's plan to bring an end to sin, to conquer death, and restore peace. Thus, Milton synthesized his religious vision and many concerns of his time on a grand cosmic scale. A second edition of Paradise Lost, with a commendatory poem by Marvell, was published within the year after Milton died. But because his poetry was somewhat out of step with the scientific and secular tendencies of his age, it did not receive much critical acclaim. The metaphysical poets, on the other hand, were more appealing to the taste of the time. The poetry of the metaphysical poets was characterized by the use of conceits and unusual language. Conceits are complex, extended metaphors. The metaphysical poets developed startling conceits, by creating long, sustained metaphors with language from the realm of religion or science, words and phrases which were not usually found in poetry. These conceits brought unlike things together in strange combinations. John Donne is considered by many as the greatest of the metaphysical poets. Although he was raised as a Roman Catholic, later in life he converted to Anglicanism. In 1615, during the reign of King James I, Donne was ordained, and then, in 1621, he became Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. Both an unusual choice of words and elaborate conceits can be found in Donne's The Canonization. First, we note that Donne freely chose words to convey his meaning. This practice allowed for the conversational tone of the first line in The Canonization, where Donne pleaded with his peers, "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love." Donne also employed a conceit by which he compared himself and his young mistress to religious martyrs dying for their persecuted love. Donne's use of this conceit brought together two images, one of sainthood and the other of sexuality. These images were not commonly associated by his audience. Donne opposed the poetic tradition known as courtly love, which sublimated erotic love through its highly stylized conventions. He viewed love as a joyful experience and sanctified his indulgent attitude with the language of the Church. Even the title, The Canonization, refers to the act by which the Church confers sainthood upon a deceased believer. Well, death entered into consideration as Donne argued that the love he had for his young mistress would be praised in the future.
As well a well-wrought urn becomes the greatest ashes as half-acre tombs, and by these hymns all shall approve us canonized for love.
In this poem, Donne claimed that future devotees would
thus invoke us, you whom reverend love made one another's hermitage, you to whom love was peace that now is rage, who did the whole world's soul contract and drove countries, towns, courts, begged from above a pattern of your love.
Also consider the famous conceit which compares the emotions of lovers to the motion of a compass in Donne's A Valediction Forbidding Mourning.
If they be two, they are two so, as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, make no show, to move but doth if the other do, and though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home.
By this conceit, that lovers are a compass, Donne avoided a long and tedious explanation of his sorrow when parting from a loved one, whether in life or perhaps in the more permanent separation of death. It revealed his intense emotions and his perceptive analysis of the psychology of love. More than this, he created his metaphor with reference to a scientific instrument that allowed him to create a new way of thinking about love. In this and many other ways, the scientific revolution reached deep into the contemporary mindset. Francis Bacon was among the first to recognize this and to philosophize about the directions these developments would take. Although he was not a scientist by profession, the persuasiveness of his essays inspired scientists to collect and collate knowledge in an unprecedented fashion. Several of Bacon's essays, entitled the Civil and Moral Essays, or Counsels, were published in 3 editions. The final edition consisted of 58 separate essays concerned with personal and public conduct, and with philosophical and religious questions. In these essays, Bacon advocated the acquisition of knowledge because knowledge gives pleasure, knowledge earns one admiration, and knowledge is useful for conducting business. Or as he wrote, studies serve for delight, for ornament, and for ability. Their chief use for delight is in privateness and retiring, for ornament is in discourse, and for ability is in the judgment and disposition of business. To obtain knowledge, he recommended that students read, discuss ideas, and write essays. He advised students, read not to contradict and confute, nor to believe and take for granted, nor to find talk and discourse, but to weigh and consider. Reading maketh a full man, conference a ready man, and writing an exact man. Bacon welcomed the radical philosophical reforms which the scientific method had initiated. His presentation of the scientific revolution in philosophical terms accelerated the decline of the medieval worldview and accelerated the expansion of the modern secular and scientific worldview. It was his desire to increase mankind's ability to control resources through advancements in useful knowledge. Ultimately, it was his hope to improve society and to make the world a better place to live. Such changes in worldview were accompanied by changes in society. One significant social change was initiated during the second half of the 17th century in England, where Aphra Behn became the first English woman to make writing her profession. She wrote several successful plays and some popular novels. Unfortunately, the success of her writing did not provide her with financial security. Behn claimed that her plays and novels were overlooked by the critics because she was a woman, but she argued her skill and inspiration in literature were not determined by sex. In recent times, Behn has been praised by women, especially in humanities disciplines, as one who made many positive contributions to culture. Behn's dramas and poems reveal that she was influenced by the political attitude of her time. Furthermore, her poems harmonize with the aristocratic overtones found in the literature of this period. They reflect the elegant lifestyles and fashionable tastes of the rich. The Willing Mistress, in particular, has for its theme amorous desire of a man for his young mistress, a common male fantasy found in other poetry of the late 17th century. When composing The Willing Mistress, Behn also used the most common metrical form of her time, a quatrain, a four-line stanza. And like many other poets of her time, Behn drew upon the classical tradition for the setting of The Willing Mistress. So what is unique about The Willing Mistress? Is it different from other poems of its time because it was written by a woman? To better appreciate Behn's individuality, we can compare her poem with another, To His Coy Mistress, by one of the metaphysical poets, Andrew Marvell. Marvell's poem was published just 3 years before Behn's poem, which means it is possible that Behn wrote A Willing Mistress as a witty response to Marvell's The Coy Mistress. Let's listen to the similarities and differences between these poems. First, we will hear stanzas from Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, then lines from Behn's Willing Mistress will be read.
Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous bird of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow-chapped power.
Down there we sat upon the moss and did begin to play 1,000 amorous tricks to pass the heat of all the day. His charming eyes no aid required to tell their softening tale. On her that was already fired, 'twas easy to prevail.
The purpose of this comparison is to show how Aphra Behn is a woman with a new attitude. She is trying to change the way the game is played. Conquest of woman by man is no longer the goal. In The Willing Mistress, Behn makes pleasure for both man and woman the goal of the game, with woman as a willing participant. As we close, let's consider the differences between the representation of women's sexual desire in Molière's Tartuffe, Racine's Phaedra, Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, and Behn's The Willing Mistress. The Willing Mistress in Behn's poem does not condemn herself for her sexual desire as Phaedra does. Contrary to Elmar's protest, the Willing Mistress is not ashamed to admit she has desires. She does not hesitate, as Marvell's Coy Mistress does. Instead, Behn's Willing Mistress remembers the encounter with her lover tenderly. In this overview of Baroque literature, we have seen how the works of many authors both conform to classical standards and how their works were original or creative. Behn gave her generation a woman's perspective in literature, and in Behn we find a precursor of the feminist movement. A new century was about to begin, and new ways of looking at the world were developing. Next time we will examine the ideas which enlightened the 18th century.
Funding for this program was provided by the Annenberg CPB project.
It was a time of shimmering art, delightful architecture, a time of fantasy, whimsy, unexpected twists, when philosophers who argued the interests of man joined with despots who pursued the interest of the state. The Enlightenment, this time on the Western tradition.
Professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we ended with a philosophe. Remember 18th century philosophers, many of whom were infatuated with the reforming rulers of Central and Eastern Europe. The philosophers believed that what Europe really needed were philosopher kings, enlightened despots to bring innovations in political, religious, and educational practices, above all to make society more rational. And the movement that followed came to be known as the Enlightenment.
Prussia's Frederick the Great was thought by Voltaire to be the nearest thing to a philosopher king in all of Europe, although the reality of Frederick's enlightened despotism was far less enlightened than the philosophers thought. And Russia's Catherine the Great was described by Diderot as having the heart of Brutus with the face of Cleopatra. Actually, she had the heart of Nero and the face of Mae West. But to Diderot, it seemed the perfect alliance. So the world got a splendid collection of his correspondence with Catherine the Great, who became great largely because of the publicity the philosophers gave her. And the same thing happened with Voltaire, who kept up a lively correspondence with Frederick the Great. It was a kind of a Renaissance relationship between men of letters who provided adulation and publicity, and rulers who provided them with gifts and subsidies and self-respect. But behind the relationships and behind the words, the reality was quite different. Privilege was not abolished in Prussia or Russia or any of the new states. On the contrary, the rulers had to rely on the nobles ever more because the nobles were the only class that was used to command. And so the rulers wound up giving nobles more privileges. In the Prussian army, for example, only nobles could be officers, a situation that went on with very few exceptions for at least 100 years. And serfdom was not abolished in Prussian and Russian and most Habsburg lands. The serfs were freed on royal estates, but not on the nobles' estates. And so, while the philosophers talked about freedom, what the enlightened despots wanted was not freedom, but regimentation and discipline. By the time Frederick II died, 4% of the Prussian population was in the army, even though his country was at peace. 4% of the American population today would give us something like 10 million soldiers. In Russia, Catherine the Great instructed her ministers to produce a constitution, had her instructions translated and circulated all over Europe to show how enlightened her country was, but nothing ever came of it. It was all like the trip she took through her dominions to see for herself how her people lived. Everywhere she went, she found clean villages with well-built houses, fat cattle, cheerful people, but the villages were actually stage sets. They were set up before she arrived. They were taken down to be reconstructed further along her route with the same cattle and the same caste of contented peasants. The man who arranged all this was Count Potemkin, Catherine's favorite and chief minister, and the villages with which he fooled the Empress, and I suspect she wanted to be fooled, these villages were called Potemkin villages, a term for empty, misleading show, and a technique still used today.
Catherine's constitutional reforms were also false. Empty fronts. And when Catherine's philosopher friends reproached her with this, she answered, "It's easy for you to talk, you write on paper. I write on human flesh." In other words, it's easy to recommend improvements when you sit in your study. It's harder to produce change in real life. But was that really the difference between her and the philosophers, or was it something else? In truth, the alliance between philosophers and enlightened despots was based on a misunderstanding. The philosophers were interested in man, his progress, his dignity. Their despotic friends were interested in the state, its interests, its power. Both believed in treating people as individuals, but for very different reasons. When the despots treated people as individuals, it wasn't because they believed in the dignity of man, but because it was to the advantage of the state. It was easier to deal with a dust heap of separate individuals than with corporations and estates and other bodies with a collective personality and collective power. So where to the philosophers the equality of the individual before the law was a principle, to the rulers it was a means to eliminate the diversity of interest groups that made governing difficult.
But even with this misunderstanding, the alliance lasted because it was also based on interest. The philosophers got respect and money and favors. The despots got useful publicity agents. And the misunderstanding was founded on distance as well. When Voltaire finally went to Berlin, when Diderot traveled to St. Petersburg, the reality was considerably less attractive than the dream. But as long as they stayed in Paris, it was easy to believe in the new societies and their enlightened despots. In the 18th century, Russia and even Prussia were to many people impossibly far away. Of those philosophers who actually went to see for themselves, some saw only Potemkin villages and were fooled. Some were disappointed with what they found. Others were bribed or slandered. But most of the philosophers were just men who wanted to believe in something. They were surrounded by inequity and injustice at home, and the real abuses that they saw around them made them ignore, made them forget, made them dismiss the much worse abuses that took place in these utopias far away, which they wanted to regard as the promised land.
So the Enlightenment was very limited. The states of the enlightened despots were modernized. They were dragged out of the Dark Ages into something a little less dark. Life in the dominions of Prussia and Austria did improve in some material respects. And the state machine and the military machine became competitive with the West. But you have to put it in perspective, and you have to remember that the enlightened despots were always more despotic than they were enlightened.
They were also exceptional, as you can see from the example of Germany, or rather, the Germanies. At this point, the Germans were hardly a nation. They had no sense of national identity. The Holy Roman Empire in which they lived was neither holy nor Roman, nor really an empire, just a congeries of states. Any unity the empire ever imposed was purely formal. The Germans were divided among 200 or 300 states, and 10 times as many autonomous sovereign entities, some of them no larger than a large ranch in Texas, 80 of them less than 24 miles wide. It was the old feudal structure preserved with dukes and counts and margraves and bishops and abbots and princes, all claiming their absolute right to rule over their little bit of land. Every ruling family claimed absolute power. They kept their position by playing the King of France off against the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. And as the 18th century progressed, they fell more and more under French influence. Travel through Germany today, and you'll see that every other town has its palace copied from the French, and probably a romantic annex like the hamlet Marie Antoinette had built at Versailles, with a dairy and a rustic cabin and a fey grotto or two. But while fashion and conspicuous consumption were copied from the West, little else was. Nor did the conspicuous consumption of the German states mean sophistication or good manners. Here was the very antithesis of the ideal of order and refinement that lay at the base of the Enlightenment. At the court of Prussia, for example, when the footmen rattled the plates at dinner, King Frederick William, Frederick the Great's father, was quite likely to whip out his pistols and shoot at their wigs to set them on fire as a punishment. And there is a description of a dinner which the Archbishop of Mainz gave in the late 18th century to his fellow electors, the princes who were symbolically the managing committee of the empire. A dinner that lasted from midday until 9 in the evening, and while they ate, a military band provided constant music. When they had finished eating, the electors, led by the court-martial, danced on the table until they fell under it. You might say that it wasn't really safe to dine with a German prince, and the princes who were also bishops were the worst. Partly because they liked practical jokes like water spouting from the seats, or dishes or glasses with holes in them. Partly because they grew the best wines in Germany and drank them, of course. At every meal, the Prince Bishop of Münster used to empty in one draught a large silver church bell full of wine, and he expected every one of his guests to do the same. Between meals, hunting was the rule. Almost every crowned head of the time loved these killing sprees. It was the only exercise they got, after all, apart from running after women or after boys. And furthermore, since each territory was considered by its ruler as his own private estate and hunting preserve, agriculture was nearly brought to a standstill. It isn't very surprising that quite a number of these princes were on the verge of madness, impotence, alcoholism, or over the verge. They were also great collectors, and their collecting was obsessive. The Duke of Württemberg collected 4,000 different editions of the Bible. The Duke of Brunswick collected vast numbers of harpsichords and spinets, the best of which he reserved for the use of his favorite cats. Another prince decided the time of day according to his own convenience. The clocks of the state had all to be set according to the hour which he chose for his own library. And the Duke of Merseburg spent all his income on furnishing a large room with every kind of bass viol, presided over by an immense double bass which was so big it could only be played from a high stool with the aid of a bow as long as a mast. So you can see that the Enlightenment didn't reach very far, and you can see why the subjects of the more backward rulers envied those people who lived in lands like Prussia, let alone France. And you can understand also why even the very limited reforms of the enlightened despots could come as a relief to their subjects at a time when most rulers were really drunken, incompetent tyrants. And yet these boorish clods lived in palaces, worshipped in churches, applauded in theaters that were epitomes of grace. The style of the 18th century is lighter, daintier, wittier than that of any other age. It's what we call Rococo, and it originated in France, where people were tired of the pretentious grandeur of 17th century classicism. When Louis XIV died in 1715, this ushered in a revolt that had been brewing for a long time against the stateliness and the restraints he had imposed. Imagination, grace, comfort took over, at least for the well-to-do, and they created a world on which crude life impinged as little as possible. Furniture grew softer and less massive. Dress for men and women got lighter and brighter. What people wanted now was not strength, but sensibility, not ponderousness, but pleasure. And so solemnity went out, elegance and fantasy came in. Probably the most interesting French patron of literature and the arts was Madame de Pompadour, who was the mistress of Louis XV. It was Pompadour who protected and helped the writers who put together the monument of 18th century thought that was the Encyclopedia. And it was Pompadour who patronized painters like Boucher, who characteristically painted her holding a book. Color, freedom, delight, enchantment are the hallmark of 18th century painting. The enchanted exuberance of Boucher, the enchanted theater of Tiepolo, the enchanted mirages of the Guardi brothers, the enchanted flippancy of Fragonard. You can see this best in the work of the most representative painter of the 18th century, Jean-Antoine Watteau, with its delicacy and charm, its superficial relations, its shimmering colors. There's nothing solid or eternal about the people and the scenes he paints. They're here to enjoy themselves in a trip, in a game, a picnic, a dance. Their relations are fragile because pleasure is fragile and transitory, and so is life. It's interesting that Watteau's best-known painting, The Embarkation, takes a traditional theme, which is a pilgrimage, and transposes it to a frivolous level. The pilgrimage to Jerusalem becomes the pilgrimage to Cythera, the island of love. Here, a group of ladies and gentlemen are embarking for Cythera, and Cythera shimmers across the water like a sort of Jerusalem, just as enchanted, but profane. And the whole scene is highly theatrical, which is another characteristic of the Rococo and of 18th century society. Rococo gardens, for example, were artificial recreations of nature with artificial waterfalls, ruins, and a wilderness, as they called it, that made gardens into picturesque places for dreaming and rambling. Gardens have always tried to recreate nature, but those of the 17th century had been stately, orderly creations. No shadow, no mystery, just straight beds, grand alleys, vast vistas. In the 18th century, however, you get irregularities, whimsy, unexpected twists. And this was also reflected in a contemporary fad for exotic things. Turkish fashions, anything outlandish. There was more trade overseas. And the ships that went to the Near East and to China brought back a lot of things now that looked different. And since they looked different, they looked attractive. They looked vaporous. They looked frivolous. They fitted the contemporary protest against the old formality. Like gardens, Rococo fashions were as elaborate, as artificial as possible, from the wigs and bows and baskets to the completely useless little shoes. The more useless, the more anti-functional, the better. And this appreciation of the ephemeral in everything is especially evident in music. What, after all, could be more ephemeral than music? Not the notes printed on paper, but the performance, which in that time could not be captured or preserved. Music is the typical happening, and music was the model of 18th century art. It fascinated Watteau, who often painted himself as a musician. It fascinated his contemporaries. The 18th century was the great age of music, or perhaps music was the great art of the 18th century, especially elegant and witty music, as epitomized by Mozart, who died in his mid-30s, just like Watteau. Even Rococo architecture looks musical. Rococo architects built theaters and opera houses designed so that the public could enjoy each other even more than what was going on the stage. And opera houses went on being built in Rococo style for 200 years. And they built churches that looked like opera houses, where churches of the past were mysterious, awesome. Rococo churches are a garden of delight. There's no trace of counter-Reformation hellfire. There's no trace of Puritan sobriety and restraint. Joy has replaced fear, scenery has replaced ritual, display has replaced inspiration. It's all stucco and gilt and curlicues and a lot of mirrors to reflect the light. God himself is a delight, and you expect the priest to burst into an aria. Now, history doesn't pay much attention to pleasure, and frivolity is not a favorite of scholars who are made of sterner stuff. But you should remember that the lighter and softer sensibility of the Rococo period also went with greater sensitivity. Sensitivity not just to our own feelings, but to the feelings of others. More and more members of the upper classes did not want their feelings bruised. And so they didn't want to see pain or suffering, which were, after all, standard aspects of contemporary life. And it was the more sensitive people of this age, like Madame de Pompadour, for example, who began to curtail torture and public executions and the repressive and cruel legislation that had survived for centuries. It was people like these who welcomed penal reform in the last third of the 18th century, or at least who welcomed campaigns for penal reform that tried to fit punishment to crime and to social utility, rather than to age-old horrors like cutting off a hand for stealing a loaf of bread. Some called for reform because they were enlightened, and I shall talk about that next time. But a lot of people wanted or accepted reform simply because their taste had changed. Their manners, their feelings had become more humane. They were more sensitive. And if you do good for selfish reasons, that's all right too. The patron saint of nature, the prophet of utility, the champion of freedom of expression, the foe of priests and organized religion, and the quintessential 18th century thinker. Reasonable, skeptical, pragmatic. The modern philosophers, this time on the Western tradition.
Theologian Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
Last time we ended on a happy note, or rather the 18th century's notion of what made people happy. 18th century philosophers, remember, hardly ever stopped talking about happiness, and especially happiness in nature, in fresh air, in living the natural life. There was one French philosopher in particular who became the patron saint of this cult of nature, a hippie of genius named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It was Rousseau who provided the great slogans of the French Revolution, which came 11 years after he died: the social contract, the general will, men are born free, yet everywhere they are in chains. But it was also Rousseau who provided the slogans for a return to nature, for a shift from reliance on the head to reliance on the heart.
Rousseau called for human beings that were genuine in a world that was genuine. Mothers suckling their own babies, parents bringing up their own children. He didn't actually follow his own advice. Every one of his 5 children ended up in a foundling hospital. But his influence was going to produce a radical change in taste, including a novel appreciation of natural beauty, wildness, forests, landscapes. Mountains and wild places had been considered a nuisance. But towards the end of the 18th century, they become visually exciting, spiritually enchanting. They become landscapes that cultivated people learn to see and enjoy, so that even the author of an essay on the management of hogs can turn away from a field of turnips and expound on the beauty of a distant scene. And nature wasn't just beautiful, it was innocent. It never led you astray. As Wordsworth was going to put it, one impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good than all the sages can. That's also pure Rousseau, and you can see that it doesn't appear to mesh with the rational and scientific mood of the Enlightenment. Rousseau found the dominant philosophy too crude, too rationalistic, too materialistic. His idea of happiness was dreamy, sentimental, private, where that of mainstream philosophers was public, or if you prefer, social. And so we have 2 parallel strains of thought, with Rousseau's being a sort of counter-culture view.
To the mainstream philosophers, happiness was something you had to earn, to deserve, to conquer, not just absorb. There wasn't only an individual right to happiness. There was a kind of public duty to be generous and make others happy. So private happiness was expected to coincide with public happiness, and in the process, it became a subject of politics. Virtue, which was seen as an important component of happiness, was now related to social harmony. In its old definition, which went back to the ancients, virtue meant manly strength. But the 18th century definition preferred a social model. The virtuous man was above all useful to his fellows. Virtue wasn't just private, as it might be, let's say, with a good Christian, it was public. And it had nothing to say about God, it was secularized. And as a result, morality in the 18th century moved towards reasonable, other-directed behavior. Reasonable behavior. Reason in everything. In the Enlightenment, virtue and happiness, science and nature were all related to reason. A universal reason which allowed you access to truth and to happiness.
And reason was also the secret of progress, material progress which went with intellectual progress and which brought with it moral progress. And with progress came optimism, an invention of the 18th century, and also the notion of utility, usefulness, all of which were combined and symbolized in scenes like this one. Utility has been defined by its high priest, Jeremy Bentham, as the property or tendency of something to preserve you from trouble or pain, or to procure you some good. So, for the individual, utility was whatever increased one's happiness or well-being. But for society, utility translated into the rule that the measure of whether a policy was right or wrong was whether it caused the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. This was utilitarianism, which combined morality and self-interest into what the utilitarians called enlightened self-interest, that doing good is ultimately in your self-interest as a citizen, and that pursuing your self-interest contributes to the common welfare. The promoters of revolution in America were utilitarians like Benjamin Franklin, and so were the founders of liberal economics like the Scotsman Adam Smith, and you might indeed say that the typical Enlightenment thinker was a utilitarian. With reformers like Voltaire or the Italian Beccaria, utilitarianism took the form of what Voltaire called common sense. It was in the name of common sense that they proposed reforms. End public executions, Beccaria said. End arbitrary arrest, he said. End torture. Abolish the death penalty. Make trials public. Moderate punishments and make them fit the crime. And have one law for all with no exceptions of class. Above all, let's be able to argue about these matters. Let's have freedom of thought. Let's have freedom of expression. It was on this ground that Voltaire clashed with a church which would not allow freedom of expression. And from this he concluded that the church and its priests were the greatest enemies of progress, hence of humankind. Voltaire wasn't against God, mind you. He probably agreed with a gentleman who prayed, "Oh God, if there is one, save my soul if I have one." In principle, though, like most philosophers, Voltaire was a deist. He thought that there was some great power, a divine clockmaker, who wound the world up and then sat back and watched humanity make a mess of it. But Voltaire was against organized religion, which he thought was a tissue of superstition and fanaticism. And he was against priests who, he said, were engaged in fooling people and misleading them. You have to have a religion, of course, said Voltaire. You have to have a religion at least to keep your servants from stealing you blind. But you must not believe in priests. That was anti-clericalism, a powerful fighting creed that preached intolerance against the intolerant, but understanding and tolerance for those who did not conform to the tenets of established religion, a religion which in those days could still condemn unbelievers to a hideous death. Voltaire spent a lot of his life defending men and women who were being mistreated because of fanaticism, prejudice, injustice, like the Calas family and the Chevalier de la Barre, who was tortured and executed essentially for disbelief. And as he struggled against fanaticism, Voltaire also practically created something new, which we now describe as public opinion.
It was in the great political and anti-clerical campaigns of the late 18th century that public opinion became a serious factor in literate societies. And the intellectual, the publicist, the man of letters, was recognized as the dynamic force behind public opinion, immensely effective in spreading the message of enlightenment, which was not only rationalistic, but also utilitarian and materialistic, a belief in technical and economic progress.
The greatest monument to this point of view is the encyclopedia which Voltaire and Diderot and their friends published through the 1750s and 60s. 17 volumes, 3 volumes of plates, all arranged in alphabetical order, which was another innovation because it abandoned traditional categories and hierarchies for a more equalitarian arrangement, which put theology after production, which put princes after locksmiths, because of the letter with which the word began. The encyclopedia is one long hymn to technical progress. The mechanical arts and their inventors get a degree of attention they never got before. Practical men are described as benefactors of humankind. There are endless articles on trades, on techniques like dyeing cloth, or making locks, or making stockings, on everything that's useful. Rank is subordinated to utility, politics is subordinated to economy. Liberty in this context is essentially economic, with political liberty a kind of icing on the cake of free enterprise. And when Diderot writes the article on political man, the article is all about agriculture, demography, and wealth, because well-being, health, work, freedom are all related. The humanism of the encyclopedists grew straight out of their materialism. They believed in evolution, in progress, in the possibility to change people, in the duty to do so, to do something for their happiness, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. To them, the universe was one great machine where everything was connected. The best and the worst aspects of this humanism can be seen in 2 completely different painters whom Diderot much admired. The first is Chardin, the painter of everyday life, clean, direct, intimate, deceptively simple, a sort of 18th century Vermeer. The second, however, is Greuze, melodramatic, moralistic, sententious, and generally soppy. Look at his girls, so innocent that you wouldn't trust them near a hayloft. Look at the families gathered round the dying father. Greuze, like Rousseau, represented the sentimental side of enlightenment. Remember, though, it was the philosopher's appeal to feelings as much as to reason which launched the campaign for less terrible punishments, for a less deadly penal code, for more human treatment of our fellows. So even second-rate painting could be useful in a good cause. Utility again. Now, the true home of utility was across the channel in Britain, where there were some important differences. Where continental philosophers looked to enlightened despots and to their centralized bureaucratic states to impose necessary reforms and produce a more efficient economy, the British felt they had an efficient economy precisely because they didn't have much of a bureaucracy and because they had avoided an authoritarian state. They were protected by the ocean, they were protected by their fleet, and they kept government down to a minimum because they felt that individuals could operate more efficiently when they were left alone and not told what to do. A good expression of this is Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, which he published in 1723. The fable is about a hive which functions fine until it's converted and regulated so that the bees can live a more virtuous life. And disaster strikes. The bees become sober, austere, charitable. Their productivity falls drastically. Their economy becomes a subsistence economy. No luxuries, no self-indulgence, no more time wasted buzzing around flowers, sniffing around, no more acquisitiveness, no more greed, no more surpluses. So there is no more honey, there is no more wax. It's a catastrophe. And the conclusion: individual vices are good for society. The selfishness of each conditions the prosperity of all. The ultimate version of this view can be found in Adam Smith, in his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, published in 1776. In this, Smith argues the fundamental harmony of self-interests. He believes in free trade, competition, production, profit, above all, no regulation. The state is simply there to see that order is kept and natural laws have their free play so that you can have a peaceful contest within a peaceful context for productive activity. Now, in this sense, utilitarianism, which informed all the thought of the 18th century, was really the doctrine of a country, of a period, of a class that felt that it was on the upswing. But since the doctrine took so many different shapes, it's hard to pick the quintessential 18th century utilitarian. If I had to choose, I would pick an Englishman, even though you probably don't think of him as such, a man named Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was born in Boston in 1706, the 10th son of a soap and candle maker who had 17 children in all. He began work at 12, he was trained as a printer, and he began to make money by printing paper currency for Pennsylvania and some other colonies. Like other printers, Franklin also diversified his business by bringing out a gazette and an almanac, which was called Poor Richard's Almanac. Almanacs were very popular publications because you didn't really have to read well in order to consult them. You could pick up bits and pieces of information and wisdom in potted form, a bit like the Reader's Digest. And Franklin's Almanac printed a lot of proverbs and jokes, and it soon became very popular. Franklin then became a public figure. He promoted a fire department, he started a lending library, he promoted a school that was going to become the University of Pennsylvania, and he also became interested in science. Everybody was interested in science in those days, but Franklin was interested in useful science. He invented the Franklin stove, which he called the Pennsylvania fireplace, and which he refused to patent as a philanthropic gesture. And his stoves, which burnt the wood that was so plentiful in those days, went on warming farmhouses and frontier cabins for over 2 centuries. He invented bifocal spectacles. He invented the lightning rod. And when he went into public service, it was first as Postmaster General of the Northern Colonies, a job which combined public utility and private profit very nicely. You probably know Franklin better as a diplomat in England and France, and of course as delegate to the Second Continental Congress, where he helped to draft the Declaration of Independence. But even when he was engaged in important national and international affairs, he kept working on basic things, like draining swamps, improving watering troughs for horses, curing smoky chimneys, getting streets cleaner. And when he was criticized for paying attention to such trifling matters, he answered, "Human felicity is produced not so much by great pieces of good fortune that seldom happen, as by little advantages that occur every day." He explained that if you teach a young man to shave himself and to keep his razor in order, you contribute more to his happiness than if you do something more grand, because, I quote him, "he escapes the frequent vexation of waiting for barbers, their dirty fingers, offensive breath, dull razors. He can shave when he pleases and with a good instrument." In his autobiography, Franklin insists that God helps those who help themselves. A person's fate is largely determined by his or her acts, he declares, and if you want to win, learn the rules of nature, especially human nature, a subject in which Franklin is just as realistic and pragmatic as in every other. In a way, his Poor Richard's Almanac serves as a guide through the hazardous territory called life. How can you depend on others when you can't depend on yourself? Why blame wolves for eating sheep when men eat a lot more than wolves do? The better you understand the world, says Poor Richard, the less you like it. But Franklin didn't despise his fellow men, he just didn't exalt them. They were fallible, self-deluded, cruel, thoughtless, and yet they were capable of enlightenment, of improvement. So even though the world was a rough place where the strong ate the weak and privilege was in the saddle, the world could be made more bearable by small, gradual, remedial acts, by self-discipline, by self-confidence. As for God, said Franklin, he was best served by doing good to men. And so Franklin suggested that if you survived a shipwreck, you were better advised to build a lighthouse than a church. Above all, Benjamin Franklin was skeptical and pragmatic, never pompous, never solemn, never systematic about his philosophy. He championed a lot of useful projects: freedom of the press, freedom of speech, popular education, equality of opportunity, and fairer treatment for Indians and blacks. And there was something paradoxical about this practical man who sometimes sounded like Hobbes, working so hard to improve this lousy human nature of ours. But he did it because he thought that we might still be coaxed and persuaded into courses of action that might make us, that might make our society a little less stupid, a little less vicious, a little more, how shall I put it, a little more human. So here was the gist of 18th century thought in action: reasonable, utilitarian, pragmatic, reformist, not revolutionist, persuaded that God helps those who help.
He is known among musicians affectionately as Papa Haydn. He uses the folk songs of his native Austria in his composition. He was trained as a choir boy in Vienna and worked for a time in Vienna as a piano accompanist for singers, where he met Prince Esterhazy, who eventually hired him as the music director for his court after hearing one of Haydn's early symphonies. Basically, this is where Haydn gained full control of his faculties, and he was basically away from the rest of the mainstream and developed as a result a style that was very unique and individual to Haydn. He was a prolific writer, wrote over 100 symphonies, concertos, operas, oratorios, solo sonatas, string quartets. 83 string quartets show the beginnings to the maturing of his musical form. The early quartets take the form of serenades or divertimentos. That's, of course, a much more casual form of music. And the middle works are more like violin concertos with string accompaniment. Well, also an important aspect of Haydn is the fact that the music of this time, and especially of Haydn, is becoming increasingly chromatic. And that simply means that we're getting a wider range of tonalities with which to work with, and it's breaking away from the more staid and tried and true tradition of the earlier Baroque period and giving us a musical language which is going to take us into the Romantic period and give us more possibilities for musical expression. Well, the most important composer, personally to me and to most musicians, is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, because Mozart was the great synthesis of all of the artistic styles of the 18th century. And in his great opera Don Giovanni, we see these three great traditions, ideas, concepts of the 18th century coming together. The first concept, that of the Rococo, the light ornamented style of the aristocracy of this period. We can also see a morality play here, which of course goes to the roots of the sensibility movement, that style which was the style of the middle class of this period. And of course then the other aspect is storm and stress, that idea which is going to become one aspect of 19th century Romanticism, storm and stress, which revels in the violent, uncontrollable aspects of nature and the dark side of the human spirit. Mozart called Don Giovanni a dramma giocosa, or a comic drama. He also referred to it as an opera buffa in other places, but probably a comic opera, a drama opera is probably a little bit more what this is all about. Comic drama is really a good explanation of what this is. We're going to see the last part of the last two scenes from Mozart's Don Giovanni, and this is the opera Don Giovanni.
Thank you.
Well, that was a wonderful rendition of Don Giovanni. In there, of course, we see, as I said earlier, those three aspects of the 18th century and the marriage of the different styles that's made possible by Mozart, the lightness and the filigree of the Rococo style, the morality of the sensibility style, that is the idea that this Don Juan gets his just deserts in the end. This greatest lover who has wrecked all of these people's lives, of course, is dragged into hell at the end. And of course, the storm and stress, the idea of this marble statue, the Commendatore, that comes to life and acting as a surrogate for Mephistopheles himself, drags Don Giovanni down into hell. So very interesting synthesis there of 18th century styles that we see in that excerpt there from Don Giovanni. Well, this late 18th century, early 19th century period here of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven is known to most musicians as the classical period in music. The classical period is that time in the late 18th and early 19th centuries that's inspired by the Enlightenment movement. As a result of this, the ideal music of this time was thought to have a universal language. It's not limited by national boundaries, and it should be noble as well as entertaining. It should be expressive, but not excessively so, and it should be natural or free of technical complications so that it can be instantly accessible to a normal listener. This, of course, is the ideal that is being inspired by the French Revolution of 1789, and the great musical patron who comes out of that 1789 revolution is Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte becomes the heroic ideal for Ludwig van Beethoven, living in Austria, to be specific, in Vienna at this time. Beethoven looks to Napoleon as a great leader, and he writes his Third Symphony, or his Eroica Symphony, the Heroic Symphony, to the inspiration, to the memory of a great man. It was initially to Napoleon. Later, as Napoleon began his imperialistic campaigns throughout Europe, Beethoven changed his idea about what Napoleon was all about, and later undedicated the symphony to Napoleon. However, we can hear this heroic ideal, this ideal of music that has instant communication, and the musical palette of Beethoven, as it has moved beyond the expressive qualities of Mozart and begins to set up that romantic period of the 19th century that's going to follow. We're going to hear a little bit of the third and fourth movements of the Eroica Symphony by Beethoven. Well, that was a brilliant performance of the last movement there of the Eroica Symphony, which might just as well be called the Promethean Symphony in honor of Prometheus, the man who brought down the divine fire from the hearth of the gods on Mount Olympus and brought it down to animate the bodies and souls of men and to release them from the bonds of ignorance. Well, this was the idea, this nobility that was supposed to inspire men to great acts at this time. And the last movement there that's beginning in the low strings, of course, is outlining this Prometheus idea, which comes from an earlier work, The Creatures of Prometheus by Beethoven. This, of course, is the end of our series. Next time we'll talk to you about romantic music.
People would want to take this degree to get, again, an overall sampling of what's out there in the industry. Our graphics applications are, again, very varied. We have everything from print all the way up to 3D animation. So if you were undecided, or if you just didn't know exactly what computer graphics might have or what's out there, this would be a great degree to take, because by the time you were finished, you would have not only the knowledge to go out and get an entry-level job, but you'd also have probably a good idea of which direction you'd like to take.
I chose graphic design because I've always been creative. I'm not the best artist in the world, but I've been pretty proficient with computers. So you don't have to be a complete great artist to go into graphic design. Bob gives us things that are going to really help put our portfolio together. I think he tries to constantly change the criteria, but he also always finds something that people are looking for in the workplace.
Our application lineup is extremely impressive. I have had students that have gone to four-year colleges and interviewed and come back and say we have as much or more than some of the other colleges in the area.
Is Western Arts and Ideas, the Brevard Community College Telecourse Humanities 2, AGUM 2230. To find out how you can earn college credit by television, call Brevard Community College. Now let's watch Western Arts and Ideas.
Hello, I am Dr. David Simmons. In this segment of Western Arts and Ideas, we will consider how various ways of viewing the universe, mankind, and society were represented in the literature of the 18th century. Various views of the universe developed as a result of the scientific revolution of the previous centuries. These were brought together in the 18th century in deism. Deists, like Thomas Jefferson, held that an impersonal force, a clockmaker god, had created the universe, then had wound it up and left it to run on its own. Deists used the term nature as a technical term to refer to the inherent order of things. The natural order included evidence of the deity's plan found in the physical universe. The natural order was considered a permanent, divinely ordained unity which exhibited both variety and harmony. These ideas were popularized by people referred to as philosophes. Three famous French philosophes were Denis Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire. These philosophers were not philosophers in the classical sense. Instead, they were popularizers who studied new developments in philosophy and science. They made practical applications of recent discoveries for everyone's benefit and published their ideas for the masses to read. Denis Diderot's Encyclopedia, or Methodical Dictionary of the Sciences, Arts, and Trades, is an example of how the philosophers popularized contemporary discoveries and philosophies. The way in which the encyclopedia was composed demonstrated a break with the past. For example, Thomas Aquinas was the sole author of the Summa Theologica, which was completed in the 13th century. In thousands of articles, Aquinas synthesized all knowledge into one system. It's difficult to imagine that anyone today would be able to get a grasp on all knowledge and systematize it according to his or her own personal views, as Aquinas did. Even in the 18th century, knowledge was growing at such a rapid rate that several authors were called upon to submit contributions to Diderot's encyclopedia. Diderot and co-editors D'Alembert and Jocor brought together contributions of more than 161 authors into 17 volumes of text and 11 books of illustrations. It was edited and published between 1751 and 1780. Although the contributions were edited and arranged by just a few editors, they were not consciously attempting to synthesize the various points of view of the several authors into one unified worldview. The purpose of the editors was to collect all knowledge for presentation to and easy access by the masses. They wanted to spread the knowledge of scientific discoveries and industrial developments as shown in this illustration of a metal workshop from the encyclopedia. They did not attain the systematic unity of Aquinas because they did not agree in all the particulars of a social and political agenda, but they shared a secular and scientific view of the world which influenced the arrangement of articles. They arranged all the articles alphabetically. This was much more radical than it sounds today. As Eugen Weber pointed out, by arranging all knowledge alphabetically, the editors of the encyclopedia placed cooks and food before government and kings. This arrangement of knowledge was consistent with modern attempts to make democratic arrangements within society. The editors of the encyclopedia were among those who wrote in order to bring about change in society. They matched legislative attempts to stop the rich and powerful from exploiting the poor with publications designed to expose economic inequity and social injustice. For example, Jonathan Swift wrote in order to call attention to the widespread poverty in Ireland. Although his parents were English, Swift was born in Dublin and raised in Ireland. Swift wrote a series of tracts on Irish affairs, the most important being the Drapier's Letters. The letters were addressed to William Wood, a financier who had intended to exploit the Irish with his scheme of coining new money to be used only in Ireland. But Swift's real target was the Prime Minister, Robert Walpole. Swift felt Walpole was contributing to the oppression of the Irish by the English. Drapier's letters were considered inflammatory by some British officials. They knew who the author of these letters was, but offering a reward for evidence failed to produce proof that it was Swift. Most of Swift's later works referred directly or indirectly to Ireland. The economic problem that inflamed Swift's anger and prompted him to write A Modest Proposal was that under English domination, the people of Ireland were starving to death. A Modest Proposal is an explosive and provocative satire which is generally considered to be the finest example of sustained irony in the English language. This tract is narrated by a humble man who is an economic projector. All sensible and reasonable solutions to the problem, such as taxing absentee landlords, raising tariffs on imports, and teaching landlords to have at least one degree of mercy toward their tenants, had been either ignored or rejected. So Swift's patriotic narrator proposes a new remedy by which Irish babies would no longer starve to death slowly. Instead, they would be bred and sold as delicacies. Specifically, the Modest Proposer suggests that babies of Irish peasants should,
at a year old, be offered in sale to the persons of quality and fortune through the kingdom.
And peasant mothers should
let them suck plentifully in the last month, so as to render them plump and fat for a good table. A child will make 2 dishes at an entertainment for friends, and when the family dines alone, the fore or hind quarter will make a reasonable dish.
The results of this scheme include that the Irish would be relieved of
the oppression of the landlords, the impossibility of paying rent without money or trade, the want of common sustenance, and the most inevitable prospect of entailing the like or greater miseries upon their breed forever.
Obviously, Swift is not really proposing cannibalism as a solution to Ireland's ills. Rather, he is venting his anger with dark and gruesome irony. Above all, Swift is attacking the callous and greedy English. This point is underscored by the anonymous narrator, who observes that when peasant children are converted into food, they
will be somewhat dear, and therefore very proper for landlords who, as they have already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children.
Although Swift's savage indignation has many targets, his main point seems to be that the Irish, and not the absentee English landlords, should be allowed, for better or for worse, to rule Ireland and determine their own fate. In the preface to his tract, A Battle of the Books, Swift claimed that
satire is a sort of glass wherein beholders do generally discover everybody's face but their own, which is a chief reason for that kind of reception it meets in the world, and that so very few are offended with it.
Swift understood human nature. Those he criticized in his satires were oblivious to his calls for reform. Even his greatest satires, A Tale of a Tub, Gulliver's Travels, and A Modest Proposal, did not initiate any significant social, political, or moral changes. As Swift became more disillusioned with humankind, his satires grew harsher. A similar development can be detected in the writing of Alexander Pope, Swift's close friend. Like Swift, Pope wrote satires, poems, and tracts to criticize evils in society. Because those he criticized became more antagonistic, as he grew older, Pope's satires grew harsher. However, some of Pope's earlier works were more optimistic. Pope was born of Roman Catholic parents at a time when the Protestants in England were violently anti-Catholic. As a boy, he was severely ill. His illness caused permanent damage to his health and physical appearance. Perhaps this was why he was educated at home. In spite of these adversities, by the time he was 23 years old, he was famous for his essay on criticism. As a young man, Pope believed that society was headed in the right direction. Like the French philosophes, he was excited about the new learning. This is an illustration by William Blake, the Romantic poet, for Pope's essay on man, in which he wrote,
"Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light."
Consistent with this positive outlook, in his essay on man, Pope popularized the philosophy of optimism expounded by the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. Pope's essay on man is his most famous poem. It is a long poem in the neoclassical style. It is composed of heroic couplets and characterized by technical perfection, moral didacticism, and satiric wit. In a satirical eulogy for his own death, Swift wrote,
"In Pope, I cannot read a line but with a sigh. I wish it mine, when he can in one couplet fix more sense than I can do in 6. It gives me such a jealous fit. I cry, pox, take him and his wit."
Pope's heroic couplets show that Pope preferred the style of the Roman poets. The Roman Republican era was a model of middle-class power which Pope and his peers admired. Pope supported the values of the prosperous middle class. During Pope's lifetime, the rising middle classes were attempting to wrestle power away from the aristocratic classes. Pope stated that his goal was to vindicate the ways of God to man, but his scientific method of reasoning tended rather to dismiss speculation about God's purposes, more so to explain the will and ways of God. Based on a deist conception of the natural order, Pope emphasized the inadequacy of human reason to comprehend the universe. He asked what basis of knowledge would be accepted and answered that only experience is a sufficient foundation for reasoning.
Say first, of God above or man below, what can we reason but from what we know?
His question implied that we cannot reason about things we do not know by experience. Therefore, what can we reason about a God who cannot be known through sense experience? We might reason that, logically, an infinite, all-knowing, beneficent God must have made everything for the best.
Of systems possible, if 'tis confessed, that wisdom infinite must form the best.
However, our reasoning concerning God's purposes is limited because
'tis but a part we see, and not a whole.
Pope argues that we are not reasoning right when we accuse God of injustice. If we consider how we dominate the creatures of the earth, we might reason more accurately regarding the evil God allows in the world.
Destroy all creatures for thy sport or gust, yet cry, if man's unhappy, God's unjust.
But Pope criticized those who found God at fault for the evil of this world. He believed that they were attempting to
rejudge his justice, be the God of God.
Instead of this, Pope recommended the approach of Leibniz when he claimed that
all nature is but art, unknown to thee, all chance direction which thou canst not see, all discord harmony not understood, all partial evil universal good, and spite of pride and erring reason spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right.
This reasoning was meant to explain that God had a rational purpose for the seemingly irrational disasters of everyday life. If whatever is right, then is the oppression of the peasant by the landlord right? It might seem that Pope would answer, yes, God has ordained such oppression. But we must consider that Pope did not mean to refer to all the details of life. Instead, Pope recommended that people should be more humble and limit their scope of inquiry.
Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man.
In other words, if everyone would study the everyday problems of survival and of humanity, then perhaps everyone would benefit from more humane treatment and better living conditions. This sentiment had many representatives later in the 18th century. For example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau studied to know himself and mankind, and then he made suggestions for social improvement. Born in Geneva, Switzerland, Rousseau left his father's business as a watchmaker at the age of 16 and set out to make his own way in life. In Turin, he became a servant in the home of a wealthy family and converted to Catholicism. Later, he met Diderot and contributed an article on musical notation for the Encyclopedia. In Paris, Rousseau had an affair with an uneducated servant girl who became his common-law wife and stayed with him throughout his life. While in Paris, he also wrote popular plays, operas, and important essays. He became famous after the publication of his discourses on the sciences and arts in 1750. In this essay, he argued that, contrary to common wisdom, progress in the sciences did not increase human happiness, but brought with it greater corruption. In his discourse on the origin and bases of inequality among men, published in 1754, Rousseau protested that the existence of private property and the political state caused inequality and oppression. In this essay, he reserved his praise for the natural man, who was still pure and undefiled by civilization. In England, at the home of David Hume, between 1766 and 1770, he wrote his autobiographical journal entitled Confessions. Unfortunately, Rousseau's feelings of alienation and his emotional instability caused tension between himself and Hume. After he left Hume's home, Rousseau wandered from place to place, finally settling in Paris, where his wife shielded him from the public. He died in poverty and near solitude in Paris in 1778. Rousseau's Confessions were the first autobiographical confessions published since Augustine's Confessions were published in the 5th century. There were significant differences between Augustine's Confessions and Rousseau's Confessions. Augustine wrote about his sinfulness as a pagan, about his godly mother who pointed him toward the truth, his conversion to Christianity, and his life in Christ. Rousseau wrote about himself, about his impressions of life, his learning experiences, and his emotions. Rousseau's Confessions illustrate a paradox inherent in the concept of individualism. It feels great to express one's individuality, but it is terrible to feel alienated from society. Rousseau reveled in his individuality, but he became alienated from his friends, and this ruined his life. The Confessions reveal that Rousseau believed human nature was naturally and inherently good until it was corrupted by civilization. He believed that to be good, society had to be unrefined and genuine. Rousseau referred to the uncivilized peoples of the New World as noble savages. In fact, he suggested that the peoples of the New World were more noble in their social behavior than the nobility of Europe. Rousseau proposed that due to their primitive state of innocence and nobility, the Native Americans were superior to the European colonizers. It is amazing that Rousseau, a friend of David Hume and a contributor to the Encyclopedia, rejected the Enlightenment glorification of reason. But Rousseau's observations of human nature, beginning with his own experience, taught him that the act of responding to sensations preceded the act of interpreting stimuli, as he wrote in the Confessions.
I felt before I thought, which is a common lot of men, though more pronounced in my case than in another's.
He explained that even as a youth,
I was already familiar with every feeling. I had grasped nothing. I had sensed everything. These confused emotions which I had experienced one after another did not warp my reasoning powers in any way. For as yet I had none, but they shaped them after a special pattern, giving me the strangest and most romantic notions about human life, which neither experience nor reflection has ever succeeded in curing me of.
Unlike Rousseau, most Enlightenment philosophers warned against the dangers of individualism and self-absorption. Instead, they believed that values shared by society had a higher priority than individual opinions. Moreover, they stressed the importance of social hierarchy in which the aristocratic classes possess political power. However, the rigid class system was being challenged by new social alignments in Western society. Women composed one group which began to break away from the hierarchic system. Although most men, like Rousseau, still believed the public domain should be governed by men, some French women exercised significant political influence through salon societies which were held in rooms like this, where they demonstrated their intellectual abilities. The rising middle classes also confronted the establishment. The industry of the middle classes generated new wealth, which entitled them, they believed, to social and political power. Voltaire's family was an upper middle class family. Voltaire was named François-Marie Arouet when he was born in Paris in 1694. He died at the age of 84 in 1778, just 11 years before the first French Revolution exploded in Paris. He was a champion of Enlightenment values, including freedom of thought, toleration, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Voltaire had a brilliant mind and was frequently engaged in public debates. At the age of 18, his association with the liberal intellectual elite, who met in the salon of Duchess Dumaine, got him into some trouble with the conservative socialites in Paris, so his father sent him on a vacation to Holland. Voltaire's father had to bring him back to Paris when Voltaire became involved with a young Protestant woman. After he returned, Voltaire began writing lampoons regarding the French nobility, and in particular, the regent, the Duke d'Orléans. These influential targets of his criticisms had him imprisoned in the Bastille for 11 months. Thereafter, he used the pen name Voltaire to earn his living writing plays. After years of traveling around Europe, Voltaire finally settled in Ferney in Switzerland, on the border nearest to France. From 1748 until 1778, this was as close as he would come to living in France. From Ferney, he wrote tracts pleading the cause of many who had been wrongly accused of political crimes. An article he prepared for Diderot's Encyclopedia did not get published because the project was banned by the king. In addition, he wrote poetry, long histories of France, and several satirical novels. Fortunately, in 1778, the year in which he died, his last play, a tragedy entitled Irene, was performed in Paris. Voltaire was invited to the premiere performance and was warmly welcomed by the audience. The trip to Paris took its toll on his health, however, and he died there. In a manner consistent with his philosophy and the way he lived his life, Voltaire refused to receive a final blessing from a priest. Some friends made sure he was buried quickly, before the local bishop could object to his being given a Christian burial. While Voltaire was residing at Ferney on November 1st, 1755, an earthquake shook Lisbon, Portugal, and killed 30,000 to 40,000 people. Roman Catholics suggested that the earthquake occurred because Lisbon authorities had tolerated Protestants. Protestants argued that God had caused it as a punishment upon Catholics in Lisbon. Optimistic deists insisted that this evil must result in a greater good. It is reported that Voltaire asked, if Pope had been at Lisbon, would he have dared to say all is well? Characteristically, Rousseau claimed that the earthquake was only a great disaster because people congregate in cities instead of living in the country. Because Voltaire was so angered by the superstitious and irrational explanations offered for the earthquake, he wrote a poem entitled The Disaster of Lisbon in 1756. This poem was a burning criticism of optimism. Voltaire also wrote a novel entitled Candide in response to the many explanations for the Lisbon earthquake circulating around Europe between 1755 and 1758. Published in 1759, Candide is Voltaire's best-known work. It remains popular because it is humorous and complex. Candide may be interpreted as a reply to Leibniz's philosophy of optimism. In 1710, the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz published his book entitled The Odyssey. In his book, The Odyssey, Leibniz explained that God considered an infinite number of possible worlds and chose to create one in which good predominates. Therefore, any particular evil is compensated by some greater good in a continual chain of cause and effect which links all the events in the universe. Due to our limited knowledge of history, we may not see or understand the good which comes upon any specific evil. Or again, as Alexander Pope wrote, all discord is harmony not understood. All partial evil is part of some universal good. Most simply stated, whatever is right. This does not mean that either Pope or Leibniz believed everything that happened was good. Instead, Leibniz taught that for everything there was a reasonable cause, and ultimately everything would turn out for good. Therefore, it would be more accurate to say that Voltaire objected to the popular misuse and the vulgar distortions of the philosophy of optimism rather than to Leibniz's teaching. Voltaire was incensed by the way in which people were led into error by their inaccurate observations and the misapplication of cause and effect reasoning. Voltaire also objected to distorted ideas like Rousseau's explanation that men brought even natural disasters upon themselves by their social behavior. Corruption, greed, and cruelty were despicable, Voltaire agreed, but he argued that these did not cause the earth to quake. In Candide, Voltaire satirized these and other common misconceptions and religious beliefs. In the end, the character Candide chooses a practical approach over a philosophic speculation when he says, "Let's work without speculating." Candide, as his name implies, is a naive, honest person. At first, he believes what he is told without hesitation. As he goes about trying to find his lost love, Cunegund, Candide matures. Although his journeys take years off his life, his experiences give him wisdom beyond his years. Through this process, Candide forms his own worldview. A worldview is a comprehensive way of dealing with reality. From our families, teachers, and life experiences, we learn to view the world in a particular way. Voltaire satirized worldviews and philosophies by creating caricatures of those whom he wished to ridicule. Pangloss is a primary example of how Voltaire created caricatures. Pangloss represents Leibniz. Of course, Leibniz was not as ridiculous as the caricature Voltaire created. Immediately, we can tell that Voltaire is joking when we read that Pangloss teaches metaphysico-theologo-cosmologology. We may not recognize the terms in this hyphenated monstrosity, but we know that it's abstract nonsense. Pangloss never tires of stating his belief that no matter what hardship one encounters, everything happens for a good reason in this best of all possible worlds.
It is proved,
he used to say,
that things cannot be other than they are. For since everything was made for a purpose, it follows that everything is made for the best purpose.
To prove this, Pangloss observes that
our noses were made to carry spectacles, so we have spectacles.
Pangloss argues that those who, like Pope,
maintain that all is right talk nonsense. They ought to say that all is for the best.
To contrast with Pangloss's optimism, Voltaire created a character identified as the Old Woman. The Old Woman's life story is a tableau of numerous and unimaginable